Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. We're doing a book club every month. I'm having a great time, much better time than I expected that I would. A lot of you are emailing me, letting you know that this has turned out to be a lot of fun. Very happy that that is working out. I had plans for our itinerary of the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, and the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to change those plans at the last minute, so I did a swap out for June. And the book we're reading in June is the follow-up to the first book that we read for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. This is her sequel to Wolf Hall, which was a historical novel set in Tudor England and centering around Thomas Cromwell, who was born, as far as we know, relatively poor and rose through the ranks of the courtier world in Tudor England, attaching himself to the household of Thomas Wolsey, who was a crucial advisor to Henry VII and then to young Henry VIII, and fell. Wolsey fell. He fell from Henry's grace, and it was only a short step from falling from Henry's grace to landing in the Tower and having the unthinkable happen. In Wolsey's case, it would have been that Prince of the Church had his head cut off by the King of England. I don't know that would have happened, but it's ghastly to think about. Of course, it was unthinkable that the king would cut the head of his queen off either. So it could have happened, but Wolsey died en route. He was up country when he got the message, the summon from Henry to be brought back to London, and he died before he could get there. And Thomas Cromwell, in Hilary Mantel's telling, was not just a member of Wolsey's household. There was a very close relationship there. We saw it in Wolf Hall. And it's commented on in this book. This book takes place in the autumn and winter of 1535. So Wolsey's dead. And yet, Cromwell can't stop thinking about him, can't stop reflexively going to him in his mind. Because Cromwell is now where Wolsey was. He is right at the king's elbow. He is the king's foremost minister. A confidant, in a way, if the creature that Henry VIII in this novel can have a confidant, then Cromwell is a kind of confidant. It's a very, very dangerous place to be, and Cromwell knows it. I think there's an argument to be made in these books that he knows it better than Wolsey did. Cromwell routinely thinks of Wolsey in these pages and reflects on the relationship they had. At one point, he mentions that, families can go rancid, friendships can end or be betrayed, but a mentorship, a teacher, that can last a whole lifetime. That is a thing that can renew and is really, really important. And that is represented in Cromwell's own life. He has gone on. We see it in this book. It's elaborately grown. He has grown a household of his own, and it's not just his family. He takes in people. He takes in a foul-mouthed urchin. He takes in distant relatives or the children of people that he likes, and raises them up. They wear his brand. They work in his household. They run his errands, and he is a father and an employer to them. It's an interesting thing, an interesting little thread that runs throughout here. That it's difficult to know, but I think it's fairly likely that nothing like that was true. Hilary Mantel, in the course of the first book, Wolf Hall, and in the course of this book, is trying to make Cromwell sympathetic, even forward-thinking. He's talking about getting people to work, giving them good, respectable jobs, making the fabric of society in its union with the king peaceful and protected. It's all very hope and change. It doesn't ring true to what we know of Thomas Cromwell, but it rings true to Hilary Mantel's vision. She wants to give us a complicated, violent, but noble figure. And she does in the course of this book. As this book opens, as the action of Bring Up the Bodies opens, Cromwell is at the peak of his power and is involved in every decision that Henry makes. He is an auxiliary brain for the king. They are out on hunts together. They are out on peregrinations over the countryside together. The book opens very vividly with a hawking scene. And Cromwell is in the party, uh, out hawking in the countryside, which was a pastime reserved only for royalty. Cromwell himself, as a blacksmith or a butcher's son in Putney, would never have been able to do that. It was against the law. Uh, so he's risen as far as he can. He is given enormous grants of land, huge amounts of money, some of it illicit, some of it not, and also he's elevated in the peerage. A number of the old family nobility that also advise Henry VIII don't like Cromwell because he's a jumped up new man. And it's intolerable to them that they're dealing with him on a daily basis, rubbing elbows with him in the council room when he's not even a baron, when he's not anybody, just a lawyer, a member of parliament or whatnot. So Cromwell eventually does get preferment in that regard too, and he views it with wry wit. He knows and never forgets exactly where he came from. There's a funny bit that comes up a couple of times in the first book and in this book of characters trying to give him a semi-noble pedigree, trying to find Cromwell's somewhere that he could be related to, and he knows he's not. But as this book opens, we get a broader sweep of Henry's England, almost always filtered directly through the consciousness of Thomas Cromwell. And there's a scene that will stand for all the others that really does that. That really gives us that England in a way that I would argue we don't get in Wolf Hall. I think that moments like this, passages like this, are a sign of a slight relaxation on the part of our author. I think Hilary Mantel was probably as surprised as anybody by how fully this project inflamed her creativity with Wolf Hall. And there's an urgency to that, to sort of, shoot your bolt, get it all out on paper. And when when Wolf Hall wins the Booker Prize, when Wolf Hall wins accolades from every critic under the sun, just every single one, whether they agreed on anything else in the world, they agreed. You should see how many blurbs are in this book. They all agreed that it was an electrifying reading experience. I was very happy to see that a lot of you who've had it on your shelf a long time found it to be so when you pulled it down. It wasn't some dead, stately, much honored thing. It was a thrilling book. But it was a first book. And in the second book, when Mantel now knows that her first book was honored, she knows the whole world is waiting for her second book. She, I don't think, had any idea that it would also win the Booker Prize, but there's a certain amount of relaxing that you can do there. It can be deadly to an author who's writing a sequel or a series of books. It can be deadly. It can lead them to prolixity. It can lead them to sort of leaning back in their armchair and bloviating. And she doesn't ever do that. But this kind of a passage, I think, fits more naturally in Bring Up the Bodies than it would in Wolf Hall. They're out in the countryside. These days are perfect. The clear, untroubled light picks out each berry shimmering in a hedge. Each leaf on a tree, the sun behind it, hangs like a golden pear. Riding westward in high summer, we have dipped into sylvan chases and crested the downs, emerging into that high country where, even across 2 counties, you can sense the shifting presence of the sea. In this part of England, our forefathers, the giants, left their earthworks, their barrows and standing stones. We still have, every Englishman and woman, some drops of giant blood in our veins. In those ancient times, in a land undespoiled by sheep and plow, they hunted the wild boar and the elk. The forest stretched ahead for days. Sometimes antique weapons are unearthed, axes that, wielded with doubled fists, could cut down horse and rider. Think of the great limbs of those dead men stirring under the soil. War was their nature, and war is always keen to come again. And that is another signal aspect of this book, is that there's foreboding always under the surface of just about anything. There is foreboding. And Cromwell, like I said, Hilary Mantel wants to make him a hero in social aspects, in political aspects, in the aspects touching on how a king rules his kingdom. Cromwell first comes in Wolf Hall, first comes to Henry's attention by daring to read him a lesson about how a king should avoid war at all costs because it's so expensive. But also religiously. Also, Mantell has Cromwell be an avatar of a better, more wholesome religion. It gets a little much. The more you know about Thomas Cromwell, the actual historical figure, the more you think. I think, and it's not a criticism of these books. I love these books, but I often wonder what they would have been like. Is it possible that they would have been even that fraction better if Mantell had just embraced the Cromwell that we know from history, the horrible, climbing, backstabbing Cromwell that we know from history. If she had embraced that figure and still made him compelling, I wonder what would have happened here. You just have to keep in mind uh, the differences in that portrayal. It's all up to the pen of the writer. In Wolf Hall, we get a Cromwell who is, for all his flaws, for all his brutality, a virtuous man, an interesting, fascinating, forward-looking man. Compare that with the Cromwell in A Man for All Seasons, for instance, the play or the famous movie. In the movie, Cromwell is played by Leo McKern. And in that movie, he is very much the picture of Cromwell that the records indicate he was. Uh, that's not the Cromwell that we get in this book. And since this Cromwell is in all things advanced, even religion, there's even some pietistic moments that crop up where Cromwell wants nothing more than to introduce the Bible in English to the ordinary people of England, which, has at times been a death sentence to even contemplate. He is part of the state machinery that is hunting down people, reformers on the continent who are trying to do that. In the book, in the novels, he is more concerned with the truth with a capital T, the vitality of Christianity. He says at one point something that Cromwell, the real Cromwell, would absolutely never have said in a room to a witness who could then report it at court or to the church. At one point he says, when you do get your hands on a Bible written in everyday ordinary English, take a look at what's in it. And more importantly, take a look at what's not in it. A direct swipe at the huge clerical machinery of the Catholic Church, most of which is not anywhere in the New Testament. And the only reason that you won't know that is if you have grown up, come to adulthood, grown to old age, and gone to your grave only hearing this stuff intoned in Latin, which you do not understand. But since the Cromwell in Bring Up the Bodies is that kind of figure, we have to look elsewhere for spiritual rot, for duplicity and emptiness. And we get that. We get a scene here with Henry Riesly and Sir Richard Rich. And those of you who maybe are familiar with A Man for All Seasons will remember Richard Rich. If you remember the movie, you'll remember Richard Rich, this horrible Weasley climber. These are portrayed in the book three-dimensionally, but they're not nice people. They're not good people. And if you've read the whole trilogy and you go back and reread this like I'm doing, they're the ones who are going to bring Cromwell down. At one point in this, the book is full of subtle foreshadowing like that. At one point, Cromwell says, on my best days, I think I'm probably good for another 20 years. And he has 5 more years to live. And he's going to die at a headsman's axe. And we know that, but he has no idea. But when he's dealing with Riesly and with Richard Rich, the narrative goes, troubled men both, he thinks. That is the he that we're talking about here. If you're coming to Bring Up the Bodies without having read Wolf Hall, that is the signature narrative gimmick of these 3 books, is that Mantell decided to narrate them in a very close focus on Cromwell. We see the world through Cromwell's eyes, but she refers to him as he instead of I, or instead of, it's a weird thing. It gets your attention at first. I've even heard some people say it stops them from reading the book. That is putting way too much emphasis on it. It's just a fun little filigree. I think it has its moments. I think it serves its purposes really well in some places. I'd love to talk with her about why she did that. But anyway, that's the he that we're talking about here. Troubled men, both, he thinks, wreathly and rich, and alike in some ways, sidling around the peripheries of their own souls, tapping at the walls. Oh, what's that hollow sound? That's wonderful. That is absolutely wonderful. The only point that I want to make here, and I won't stress it too much, is that that was definitely Thomas Cromwell. That description was Thomas Cromwell. It wasn't something he was wryly thinking about. Well, maybe he did think it about other people and just not be aware that it was also true of him, but it's a little much. But we're reading 100 pages for today. We're going to read 100 pages a week until we're done with Bring Up the Bodies. And at one point later on, towards the end of our 100 pages today, one of his friends and sparring partners and enemies, one of these weird courtly relationships where you don't really know where you stand with the other person. You don't know whether or not they're remembering your words and are going to take them somewhere to someone. You don't ever really know that. Cromwell has Riesling and Rich over to his house all the time in the course of these books. They come over for meals. They come over for conferences about business. They come over about strategizing on the ways to do the king's bidding. And they are going to betray him. They are not going to stick with him. We don't know that. Mantell doesn't. She pays her readers the compliment of not freighting those scenes so that you know that something's up. There's no background music. But at one point at the end of these 100 pages, a character asks a question of Cromwell, and he gives a little aria that I love. I quoted it in my own review of this book, and I come back to it because it epitomizes where we're finding Cromwell as Bring Up the Bodies begins. It's Stephen Gardner he's talking to, I believe, in this scene, who says, do you ask yourself, why do people want to kill you? And Cromwell laughs and says, why, Stephen, much in this life is a mystery, but that is no mystery at all. I was always first up in the morning. I was always the last man standing. I was always in the money. I always got the girl. Show me a heap, and I'm on top of it. It's wonderfully done. It's just beautifully readable. But I think it's meant to show us the overconfidence that Cromwell is starting to feel. Even though he's the most cautious man in the world, a certain amount of complacency is creeping in around the edges because he gets to make or break lives. He gets to ruin people and seems to have Henry's complete approval. But there are cracks appearing. There are tensions at court. It is not a happy court because Anne Boleyn has failed. She made promises. If she hadn't made promises, I wouldn't say that she failed. I would say it would be ridiculously sexist to say so. But she did. She made promises to Henry. I will be a good and faithful wife. I will give you sons. And she has failed by this point, to the point where Henry is starting to pall in his affections. The spell that she cast over him when she was denying him her bed, the spell that she cast over him when she was promising him heirs of his body, legitimate male heir sons, the spell that she cast just in general, this alluring little creature from France who had all sorts of, from the French court, who had all sorts of new and alluring ways, that spell is over by the point we start this book. And Henry is starting to two things. One is that he's starting to have a fascination for Jane Seymour, who's hilariously described in this book as a pale, ghostly little thing who looks at all men as though they were an unpleasant surprise. Mantell does not like Jane Seymour at all. I don't know what she thinks about her Anne Boleyn. I'd be interested to see what you think. Do you get the impression that she likes Anne Boleyn, feels any sympathy for her at all? It's, I think, a remarkably unsympathetic portrait that is even so affecting. It is even so moving. Anne is never made likable, and yet you can't help but feel for her in this book. This book is her downfall, and those cracks are starting to show. Henry is starting to ask questions that he would have forbidden anyone to ask 4 years ago. He's starting to ask, was she actually free to be my wife? Was she? Wasn't she pre-contracted to Harry Percy? It's now the Earl of Northumberland. When they were younger, before she went to France, didn't she contract with him? I've heard rumors to that effect, and if that's true, well, then our marriage was never legitimate. It was bigamous. very similar arguments to the ones that came across his mind to get rid of his first wife. At this point, in this autumn and winter, no hint, not even a hint, that if Henry wanted to put aside Anne Boleyn, he would kill her. Not even a hint of that yet. Although there are forebodings in the chapters, in the pages that we're reading for today, the ghost of Wolsey comes to Cromwell and says, if you're getting the impression that he wants to change his wife, find a way to help him change his wife. He wanted to change his wife, and I failed to help him, and I'm dead. So that's a pretty foreboding moment there. But so far, no outward sign is touching the supremacy of Thomas Cromwell. So we will watch while he navigates the downfall of a queen. And we'll move on. We're going to read the next 100 pages for next week. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. I hope you're all enjoying this. I'll see you next week.